come back. Or maybe you never really left. Here, time fades and night knows no dawn. You think you're looking for solace, a distraction perhaps. But what you find here will bring neither respite nor sleep. Can you feel the heavy air? It's not just the darkness. It's the memories of those who listened before you. Their breaths suspended, their heartbeats still quickening, somewhere in that space between the real and the unexplained. The stories I'm going to share tonight are not insignificant. They carry a weight, a presence. They will seep into you, waiting for the moment when your mind is most vulnerable. For it is not I who tell, but they who tell themselves through me. Are you still here? Then listen. But remember, what you hear here never stays here. These tales may well follow you in the dark, just over your shoulder. Father Armand was not a particularly curious man. He lived in a pious routine, content with the monotonous confessions of his faithful and the sermons he repeated every Sunday in his little country church. But that day, his life took a turn he could never have imagined. It all began when workmen renovating the church discovered a trapdoor beneath the main altar. The trapdoor was sealed, covered with ancient symbols that no one recognized. Intrigued, they called the priest, who, despite palpable hesitation, had the access open. Inside, they found a solid wooden box, intricately carved with a rusty padlock that looked as if it hadn't been touched for centuries. The box was sinister looking. Something in its aura chilled the air around it. The workers refused to touch it, so Father Armand decided to take it himself. He took it into the sacristy, placing it on his desk with almost superstitious caution. The padlock seemed fragile, but resisted every attempt to open it. Yet a strange pulsation, like a heartbeat, seemed to emanate from the wood. That night, Armand dreamt of the box. In his sleep, he heard whispered prayers, desperate voices, as if locked inside. He awoke with a start, his forehead beaded with sweat. He got up, lit a candle, and headed for the sacristy. Darkness hung heavy in the corridors, and every step sounded strange, as if someone were following him. When he reached the box, he noticed something strange. The padlock was open. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of small, folded parchments yellowed with age. Each piece of paper bore a fine, hurried handwriting, as if scrawled in haste. He took one and unfolded it. "Lord, save my soul. The darkness is engulfing me." Armand frowned. He took another. "I can't sleep anymore. I can hear them. They're watching me." And yet another. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sold my soul." Each of the papers seemed like desperate prayers, cries for help from terrified people. But something about these words disturbed him deeply. They didn't sound like ordinary prayers. It was as if these souls had been imprisoned in their own words. Then there was a sound, a whisper, barely perceptible, but there. Armand turned abruptly, his candle flickering in the icy air. The room seemed darker than before, as if the shadows had drawn closer. And as he stared at the box, he saw one of the scrolls lift slightly, as if pulled by an invisible breeze. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. A visceral fear invaded him. The whispers intensified, becoming distinct voices, desperate whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Help us! Free us! We are here!" Armand felt his heart racing. He closed the box hastily and stepped back, but the voices didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, as if echoing in his mind. The shadows around him danced on the walls, taking on indistinct, grotesque shapes. And then a scream, an inhuman howl that tore through the silence, making him fall to his knees. It was a voice full of anger and despair, but also of power. Something had just been awakened. The sacristy door swung open and a black figure entered. It wasn't human. Its contours seemed blurred, as if it were made of moving shadows. Two glowing eyes stared back at Armand, burning with unbearable rage. "You've opened what was meant to remain closed." The priest tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The figure advanced slowly, and with each step the voices became louder, more deafening. Armand felt his mind waver, unable to bear the infernal din. "These souls belong to me. And now, yours too." The last thing he saw was the box, which seemed to pulsate like a living heart, slowly opening up to engulf him. Then everything went black. The next morning, the workmen found the sacristy empty. The box had disappeared, as had Father Armand. But ever since, murmurs have echoed through the church at night, desperate prayers, scrawled on scattered papers that keep reappearing. Despite all efforts to burn them, the box, meanwhile, has never been found. The sanctuary of divine grace stood atop a hill, solitary and imposing, surrounded by a dense forest that daylight struggled to penetrate. This place of prayer had been abandoned for decades, but its reputation remained. The elders said that a statue of an angel, once a symbol of protection, had been defiled. No one really knew how, but those who ventured near the chapel claimed that the angel was crying. Not ordinary tears, but a thick red liquid blood. One night, Julian, a historian fascinated by religious mysteries, decided to investigate. Rumors had driven him to the shrine, despite warnings from the villagers. Legends were just exaggerations, he thought. He believed in facts, in hard evidence, not in scary tales whispered around a campfire. The climb to the chapel was an ordeal. The overgrown path almost seemed to want to hold Julian back, as if nature herself were trying to dissuade him. The mist thickened as he advanced, and the moonlight struggled to pierce the growing shadows. When he reached the chapel, he was struck by its dilapidated state. The stained glass windows were broken, the walls cracked and overgrown with vines. A heavy wooden door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. Julian pushed open the door, his heart beating faster than he would have liked. Inside, the air was frigid, laden with a metallic smell. The benches were overturned, as if a struggle had taken place here, but it was at the back of the chapel, near the altar, that his gaze was drawn. The statue of the angel, immense, magnificent, despite its degraded condition. Its wings, once outstretched in a protective gesture, were broken, hanging as if torn off. Her face, with its expression of eternal sweetness, seemed marked by profound sadness. Julian approached slowly, Each step echoed heavily in the empty nave. The closer he got, the more he noticed the strange details. The cracks in the angel's stone were unnatural. They seemed engraved, as if some monstrous force had wanted to break this sacred figure. And as he got closer, he saw blood. Small drops, then larger streaks running down her face from her eye sockets to the base of the altar. He touched the liquid with his fingertips. Warm. It couldn't be blood. But every fiber of his being screamed that it was. Then a voice sounded, faint but distinct. A voice that seemed to come from nowhere, or perhaps from everywhere at once. "Why are you here?" Julian gasped and stepped back, searching with his eyes for the source of the sound. But there was no one there, only him. And the angel. His gaze returned to the statue, and he felt an icy chill run down his spine. The angel's eyes, set in stone, seemed to stare back at him. No, they were staring at him. He was certain of it. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was louder now, deeper, but still tinged with sadness. Julian tried to speak, but his throat was knotted. He stepped back again, but his feet stumbled against an overturned bench, knocking him to his knees. When he looked up again, he saw that the statue had changed. The cracks in the stone seemed to have widened. Thin but palpable shadows escaped, snaking around the angel like snakes of smoke. And her lips, once set in stone, were now moving slowly. "They broke me. They condemned me to watch. But you awakened what was sleeping here." Julian felt pure panic rise up inside him. He scrambled to his feet, but his body seemed numb, as if held back by an invisible force. The statue was slowly crumbling, pieces of stone falling to the ground with sinister creaks. This was no longer a simple angel. Something else. Something ancient and malevolent was emerging. At last, moonlight broke through the shattered canopy, illuminating the scene. Shadows twisted, taking on grotesque shapes, humanoid but impossible. Murmurs filled the chapel, inverted prayers, muffled cries. Julian tried to run, but the shadows enveloped him, clinging to him like icy claws. "You can't run. They're coming for you, just as they came for me." The last thing he saw was the angel's face, now distorted, its eyes filled with pure, burning hatred. A heart-rending scream echoed through the chapel, but he never knew if it came from him or from the thing he'd just set free. The next day, the villagers found the chapel door wide open. Inside, there was nothing left of the angel, only a burnt shadow on the wall and a trail of blood that seemed to be moving away into the forest. Julian never returned. The walls of the old convent of St. Luc were impregnated with silence, as if the place had been holding its breath for centuries. The few visitors who still dared to approach said that the cloister seemed alive. The statues of the monks, frozen in prayerful poses, gave the impression of moving when you weren't looking, and in the stillness of the night, murmurs echoed under the arches like a continuous litany from the very bowels of the earth. Marie, a history student, had come to study the convent's forgotten archives. She had heard about the legends, an order of monks that had disappeared, incessant prayers recited to appease a force that no one understood. But it was all local folklore, she thought. Stories to keep the curious away. Night had fallen by the time she entered the cloister, flashlight in hand. She advanced cautiously. Light danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move. The statues of the monks arranged all around were so realistic that Marie felt slightly uneasy. Their faces seemed to bear a mixture of peace and anguish, a paradox she couldn't explain. In the center of the cloister, a trap door was hidden beneath a stone slab. She had read about it in an ancient manuscript, a brief, almost faded mention of a secret passage leading to a crypt. This crypt, according to legend, housed the monks' true prayers and their sins. Marie found the slab and with effort managed to open it. An icy breath escaped from the opening, accompanied by a distant murmur. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity won out. She descended slowly, one hand on the rusty ladder, the other clutching her flashlight. The crypt was narrow, its walls covered with ancient engravings, psalms, prayers, but also symbols she didn't recognize, strange and disturbing. At the far end of the room, a small altar stood, surrounded by extinguished candles. On the altar rested a massive leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Marie approached it, fascinated. The book seemed to breathe, each page emitting a slight vibration. She opened it, her fingers trembling, and read the first lines. "We pray to hold back what must never come out. Our voices are our only bulwark against the darkness." A shiver ran through her. She turned another page. The words seemed to write themselves before her eyes, as if the book were alive. The prayers became more and more desperate, the sentences broken, as if whoever had written them had lost his mind. "They're coming. Our prayers are running out. They won't stop." Suddenly, a faint glow lit up the crypt. Marie looked up, but she was alone. Yet the walls seemed to vibrate slightly, and the whispers she had thought imaginary became more distinct. A low, grave litany echoed in the air, as if the walls themselves were singing. She stepped back, but her flashlight flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, to detach themselves from the walls. They were taking shape, becoming indistinct but humanoid silhouettes. Their movements were jerky, unreal, as if they were struggling to exist. "Join us!" The voice seemed to come from everywhere. A taller figure stepped forward, his features blurred but imbued with overwhelming authority. She reached out a hand toward Marie, and the air turned frigid. Her legs refused to move, as if the floor had trapped her. "You've opened the door. Now you must pray with us." Marie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows surrounded her, and in their icy embrace she felt a deep pain, as if her spirit itself were being torn from her body. The litany became deafening, the voices overlapping in frightening chaos. She lost consciousness. When Marie awoke, she was kneeling in the cloister, surrounded by the statues of the monks. But something had changed. The faces of the statues were different, more realistic, almost alive. One of them, standing next to her, seemed to look at her with an expression of despair. She wanted to stand up, but her body refused to obey him. Her hands were clasped in prayer, her lips reciting a litany she didn't understand. She tried to scream, to move, but nothing worked. Then she understood. She was part of them now. Just another statue in this cursed cloister, condemned to pray to hold back what she had freed. And under the arches, the litany continued The monastery of Saint-Martial, nestled atop an isolated mountain, had long since been abandoned, but a rumor persisted. In one of the forgotten rooms, an antique mirror, massive and adorned with strange engravings, still waited. This was no ordinary mirror. It was called the penitent's mirror, an object supposed to reveal the darkest sins to anyone who dared to look into it. Legend had it that monks had used it to confront their own souls, but they had all disappeared in the end. Some whispered that they had become shadows dancing in the reflections of the glass. One cold, moonless autumn night, Eric, a photographer fascinated by abandoned places, went to the monastery. He was looking for unique images, and the story of the mirror had captivated him. The climb up to the monastery was arduous, the steep path overgrown with vegetation, as if nature wanted to dissuade anyone from approaching. The imposing silhouette of the building loomed in the half-light, its stone walls oozing humidity and time. As Eric pushed open the heavy doors, a shiver ran through him. The air inside was frigid, laden with the smell of musty, damp stone. He turned on his flashlight, illuminating a vast but dilapidated hall. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor. After a few minutes' exploration, he finally found the room he was looking for. A heavy wooden door marked with engraved symbols stood before him. Legend spoke of a specific room where the mirror rested, and he was certain this was it. With an effort, he pushed the door open with a sinister creak. The room was plunged into darkness, but in the center stood the mirror, immense, majestic, surrounded by religious engravings. The gilded frame was adorned with angelic figures, but their faces seemed twisted, distorted by unspeakable pain. The glass itself seemed strange, reflecting the light irregularly, almost as if it were absorbing some of the clarity. Eric approached, fascinated. His own reflection appeared vaguely, but there was something else. A shadow, something moving in the mirror, but not in the room. He instinctively stepped back, but curiosity won out. He took out his camera and snapped the first image. The next instant, he felt an icy breath on his neck. He turned around abruptly, but there was nothing there. Yet the atmosphere seemed heavier, as if the room itself were alive. He moved closer to the mirror, hesitantly reaching for the glass. The cold emanating from the surface was almost unbearable. When he finally placed his palm against the mirror, a searing pain flashed through his mind. The reflection inside was no longer his own. It was a twisted version of himself, eyes filled with a hatred he didn't understand. "You want to see, don't you?" The voice echoed in his mind, low and deep, but he wasn't sure if it came from him or from the mirror. The reflection began to move, independent of his own gestures. It stared back at him with an unhealthy intensity, a cruel smile distorting its face. The walls of the room seemed to darken, the angelic carvings on the mirror frame transforming into demonic figures, their faces expressing absolute terror. Murmurs began to rise, low voices, incomprehensible but insidious. "Take a good look, Eric. See what you're hiding." The reflection raised a hand, and suddenly images flashed in the glass. Memories Eric had buried, actions he'd preferred to forget. The betrayal of his friends, the lies he'd told, the moments when he'd chosen his own interests over those of others. But that wasn't all. The image of a car accident emerged. A rainy night, a body lying on the side of the road. Eric felt his breath catch. He'd thought no one had seen him that night, that the event was behind him. But the mirror knew. It knew everything. The voices intensified, turning into heart-rending screams. The shadows in the mirror began to emerge, stretching out, materializing in the room. Humanoid shapes, blurred but terrifying, now surrounded him, their black fingers outstretched toward him. Every sin has a price. Eric tried to flee, but his legs refused to move. The shadows drew closer, and one passed right through him. An indescribable pain tore through his body as if it were tearing out a piece of his soul. He fell to his knees, his gaze still riveted to the mirror. His reflection was gone. In its place, the shadow that had possessed him smiled, triumphant. "You're part of us now." The glass of the mirror seemed to ripple, and in an instant, he was sucked in. The room fell silent again. The next day, the monastery was empty. The mirror was still there, but in its reflection, a new silhouette appeared. Eric, trapped, his eyes crying out for help. But no one would ever come. The church of Saint Damien stood at the edge of a dense forest, isolated, almost forgotten. Its stone walls seemed to absorb the sunlight, and at night it disappeared almost entirely into the surrounding darkness. The villagers didn't go there anymore, not since rumors began to circulate about a particular confessional buried deep in the nave. It was said that those who confessed there never came out the same. Legend had it that a priest had once been possessed while hearing a man's sins. The demon, taking possession of his spirit, transformed the confessional into a portal to the unimaginable. Since then, the few souls who had dared to kneel inside had emerged broken, their faces scarred by a terror that never faded. One evening, drawn by morbid curiosity and frightening tales, Julian, a writer in search of inspiration for his next novel, stepped through the church doors. The heavy solitude of the place didn't bother him. On the contrary, it inspired him. But what he didn't know was that this place was not simply a setting, but a living entity, something waiting. Moonlight shone with difficulty through the dusty stained glass windows, casting distorted patterns on the stone floor. Julian's every step echoed, amplified by the overwhelming silence. The nave seemed to stretch on forever, as if the church refused to reveal its secrets to him. And then he saw it. The confessional. It stood at the far end, a dark, imposing structure adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to move in the flickering light of his flashlight. A strange odor wafted through the air, a mixture of burnt wax and something more metallic. Blood, perhaps. Julian approached, his fingers brushing the engravings. The symbols were unfamiliar. They resembled an ancient, almost living script. The air around him grew colder, and a faint, barely perceptible murmur echoed through the nave. "Come in," he gasped. The voice was soft, almost inviting, but it seemed to resonate directly in his mind. He looked around the room, but he was alone. Shaking himself, he told himself it was his imagination. Perhaps he'd read too much about this place before coming. Yet a strange fascination compelled him to open the confessional door. As he entered, the air became even more frigid. The wood inside was worn, etched with marks he didn't understand. Kneeling slowly, he felt an invisible weight fall on his shoulders as if the place was already judging him. Confess. This time, the voice was clear, deep, and seemed to emanate from the other side of the partition where the priest should have been. But Julian knew there was no one there. He tried to stand up, but his legs refused to move. An invisible force kept him on his knees. I have nothing to confess, he stammered, his voice trembling. A weak laugh rang out, reverberating through the confessional like an eerie echo. Everyone has something to confess. Let me help you remember. The world around Julian seemed to waver, as if reality itself were collapsing. Images flashed through his mind, memories he'd forgotten or buried, lies he'd told, actions he'd regretted, moments when he'd done wrong without considering the consequences. Each sin, big or small, came back to him like a hammer blow, and with each image, the murmur grew. You're a liar, a thief, a selfish man. Julian tried to resist, but the images became clearer and clearer, more and more personal. He saw a night, years ago, when he'd left a wounded man on the side of the road, claiming he didn't want to get involved. He saw the tears of his sister, whom he had betrayed for his own gain. Murmurs became screams, heart-rending howls that invaded his mind. And then, silence. Total, overwhelming. Julian looked up, and through the confessional grate he saw eyes. Not human eyes, but black, empty sockets that seemed to absorb all the light. You're mine now. The confessional door opened abruptly, and Julian fell to his knees on the cold church floor. His spirit was broken, his thoughts muddled. He could still hear the murmurs like an incessant litany in his head. He struggled to his feet and staggered out of the church, but when he reached the outside, he realized he no longer recognized the world around him. Everything was dark and distorted, as if a part of him had been left behind. From that day on, people who come across Julian say that he's constantly whispering incomprehensible words and avoiding his reflection. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, he stops, stares into space, and whispers, "Confess." And somewhere, in the church of Saint Damien, the confessional awaits its next soul. The library of the Saint Benoit Monastery was a forgotten labyrinth of dusty books, dark alleys, and buried secrets. Among the hundreds of religious and theological volumes, there was one work no one dared speak of. It was called Liber Abjurationis, the Book of Abjurations. Its pages, it was said, contained forbidden prayers, exorcism formulas so powerful that they could invoke what they were supposed to repel. Legend has it that a monk, many centuries before, wrote the book after a confrontation with a demon he had failed to expel. Frustrated and terrified, he had recorded unsanctified methods for countering the forces of evil, incantations which, if recited incorrectly, would open the gates of hell. That evening, the library was plunged into almost total darkness. Only the flickering light of an oil lamp revealed a solitary figure. Luke, a young priest recently arrived at the monastery, was exploring the premises in search of answers. For weeks, strange things had been happening within the walls of the cloister. Whispers in unknown languages, shadows moving without source, crucifixes knocked over without explanation. The old priests refused to speak, but Luke had heard fragments of whispered conversations about the book. And now it was here. The black leather binding seemed to absorb light, the engravings on the cover almost illegible, forming symbols that gave goosebumps just looking at them. Luke hesitated. He knew he shouldn't have touched it, but curiosity won out over caution. He gently pulled the book from the shelf, and as he did so, a slight murmur ran through the room, almost extinguishing his lamp. He opened it to a random page. The writing was old, almost illegible, but a phrase in Latin caught his eye. Abjuro te ut redeas ad abyssum. I order you to return to the abyss. The sentence was accompanied by strange drawings, twisted figures, humanoid but grotesque, deformed beings that seemed to writhe in pain or ecstasy. Luke read the words in a low voice, and in that instant, something changed. The temperature in the room dropped abruptly. His breath misted the air, and an oppressive silence pervaded the library as if the world were holding its breath. Then came a muffled creak, followed by a distant murmur. Luke looked up, but no one was there. Yet he felt a heavy, oppressive presence, as if invisible eyes were staring back at him. He hurriedly closed the book, but the murmuring didn't stop. On the contrary, it became clearer, closer. "Why did you call me?" The voice was hoarse, distorted, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Luke turned around, his lamp in hand, but the light flickered, unable to pierce the thickening shadows around him. He tried to recite a prayer, but the words escaped him. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. A shadow materialized in front of him, tall, twisted. It seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Two red eyes, like embers, slowly opened in the darkness. The figure advanced, and each step sounded like a thunderclap. "You spoke the words, priest. You belong to me now." Luke stepped back, his heart beating wildly. He remembered the warnings. The formulas in the Book of Abjurations were never to be recited without preparation. They were a double-edged blade, capable of attracting what they sought to repel. The shadow reached out a deformed hand towards him, and the instant it touched him, a searing pain shot through his body. He fell to his knees, screaming, but his voice sounded muffled, as if the library itself engulfed him. "You want to chase me away? Then look into the abyss you've opened." Luke felt his mind waver. The walls of the library disappeared, replaced by an infinite void, a space of pure darkness where grotesque shapes danced and howled. Twisted faces, cries of pain and hatred surrounded him. He felt his soul shatter, every sin he'd committed coming back to haunt him in the form of specters. And then everything stopped. He found himself back in the library, lying on the cold floor. The book was closed beside him, but an engraving had now appeared on the cover. A figure, kneeling, arms outstretched, engulfed by shadows. His own face. Luke left the library that night, but he was never the same. The shadows followed him wherever he went, and he could still hear that voice whispering inside his mind. The Book of Abjurations returned to its shelf, patiently awaiting its next reader. The village of Saint-Michel, lost among the misty hills, was known for its dark legends and tenacious superstitions. Among them, one rumor kept coming back. a black host discovered centuries ago in the ruins of an ancient abbey. It was not a blessed relic. It was considered a curse, a profane object created during a black mass. It was said to carry within it an entity capable of destroying those who tried to decipher it. For years it had been kept in a double-locked reliquary, buried in the crypt of the village church. No one dared touch it. But when the church was abandoned and left to rot, the reliquary disappeared, and with it, the village's fear. Until recently, that is. One night, strange noises echoed through the old church. Low, guttural chants in a forgotten language. A few curious villagers armed with lanterns had ventured to the entrance. They didn't dare enter, but they did catch sight of moving shadows behind the broken stained glass windows. The next morning, something strange was found. A blackened host lying on the dusty altar. Mathieu, a theology student with a passion for the history of sacred objects, had heard about the discovery. He went to the village, convinced that it was a fake or a ritual object that had been misinterpreted. But when he entered the church to examine the host, he immediately felt an unusual coldness, an almost tangible weight in the air. The host, small and simple, seemed to be made of solidified ashes. It gave off a strange odor like a mixture of sulfur and burnt wax. Mathieu stared at it, fascinated as a faint hum echoed in his head. He shook his head, persuading himself that it was only a suggestion from his mind. He decided to take it with him for closer examination. But no sooner had he left the church than he felt a presence behind him. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Yet the air seemed heavier, and a shadow, though imperceptible, seemed to follow him. That night, he placed the host on his desk in the small house he had rented for his stay. He looked at it by candlelight, his eyes fascinated by the patterns engraved on its surface, symbols he didn't recognize but which seemed to move. He tried to write down his observations, but a sudden fatigue overcame him. His head spun, and he fell into a deep sleep. When he awoke, the candle was out and the room was pitch dark. He couldn't remember lying down. A distant murmur echoed through the house, faint but incessant. He stood up, searching for the source of the noise. His steps led him to his desk, but the host was gone. In its place, a trail of black ash led to the floor. The murmuring intensified, becoming a litany. A faint, reddish light appeared in the corner of the room, and a massive shadow detached itself from the wall. It had no distinct form, but it seemed to breathe, to vibrate, as if it were alive. Mathieu stepped back, his heart beating wildly. But with every step he took, the shadow drew closer. "You took her?" The voice echoed through the room, low and husky, as if coming from several beings at once. Mathieu tried to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. "The host is not an object. It's a seal, and now you've broken it." The shadow stepped forward, and Mathieu felt an icy coldness come over him. Visions flashed through his mind. Forgotten rituals, obscene chanting, priests dressed in black offering sacrifices before an altar covered in blood. He saw hands reaching out, taking the host, muttering words that should never have been uttered. The light flickered and shadow enveloped Mathieu. He fell to his knees, crying out, but his voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. His thoughts became confused, invaded by images of pain and fire. The black host now glowed with an intense red light, as if pulsing, alive. You haven't just freed an entity, you've opened a door. Mathieu felt his body twist, his skin burn. The shadow melted into him, penetrating every fiber of his being. The last thing he heard before sinking was a scream, not his own, but that of 1,000 souls trapped in eternal agony. The next morning, the house was empty. Only a trace of black ashes remained, forming a perfect circle on the floor. The black host was gone. In the weeks that followed, villagers reported seeing a figure walking the streets after dark, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. And in the abandoned church, the guttural chanting resumed. But this time, no one dared approach. The black host had found a new host. In a small, forgotten church deep in the hills of southern Italy, a mysterious relic had been hidden for centuries. It was called the Testament of Judas, a fragment of manuscript written, according to legend, in the cursed apostle's own hand after he had betrayed Christ. The text, it was said, contained forbidden confessions and words from a mouth other than that of God. No one had seen the testament for generations, but when renovations began on the dilapidated church, a sealed crypt was discovered. The workmen refused to enter after hearing strange noises and feeling an icy cold emanating from the depths. It was then that Father Augustin, a man known for his devotion and unshakable faith, was called in. Augustin descended alone into the crypt, armed with his Bible and a candle. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, a metallic stench that made him nauseous. The crypt seemed larger than it actually was, its walls covered with Latin inscriptions that time had almost erased. In the center, a small wooden box, black and adorned with iron fittings, rested on a pedestal. When he opened the box, a rolled, yellowed sheet of parchment appeared. The text appeared intact, written in red ink. As if time had had no effect on it, he began to read in a low voice. But no sooner had he uttered the first words than an icy blast passed through the crypt. The candles flickered and went out, plunging him into total darkness. The silence was absolute, but a murmur was soon heard. Faint at first, it intensified until it became a clear, distinct voice. "Why did you open it, Augustine?" The priest flinched. He tried to light his candle, but his hands trembled too much. The voice resumed, echoing in his mind. "This will was not meant for your eyes. You broke the seal. Now you must listen." Despite the fear knotting his stomach, he tried to recite a prayer. But with every word he uttered, the voice laughed, a deep, malice-laden laugh. "You think your faith will protect you. Read, Augustine. Finish what you've started." He couldn't help himself. His hands, as if guided by an invisible force, unrolled the parchment, and his eyes rested on the words engraved in red. The phrases were confessions of Judas's deeds, dark thoughts, but also forbidden truths. Each word seemed to burn in his mind. "I didn't betray him out of greed, but because he wanted me to. He chose me for this, and in that choice, he condemned me to walk between worlds forever." Suddenly, a shadow materialized before him, a humanoid silhouette but blurred, distorted as if oscillating between the tangible and the ethereal. Two black, empty eyes seemed to stare back at him. "You're looking for answers, Augustine, but answers come at a price." The room began to shake. The inscriptions on the walls lit up with a red glow, and murmurs rose up, forming a frightening chorus. The faces of Judas, or what Augustin imagined to be him, appeared on the walls, looking at him, judging him. "You want to understand forgiveness? Then look." The figure held out a hand, and suddenly the priest was engulfed by visions. He saw Judas, hanging from a tree, his face frozen in an expression of suffering. But instead of dying, he opened his eyes, eyes full of hatred and despair. He walked through the ages, observing the sins of men, unable to die, unable to be forgiven. "Every word of this will is a fragment of my damnation, and now, Augustine, it's yours too." The priest tried to shout, but no voice escaped his throat. The shadow reached out, stretching a hand across his chest. An unbearable pain seized him, as if his soul had been ripped out, shattered into pieces. When he awoke, he was kneeling in the church, the will in his hands. But he was no longer the same. His eyes, once filled with faith, were now empty. The faithful who came to see him said he was muttering incomprehensible words, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a language no one recognized. The testament of Judas was returned to the crypt, but the church of Saint-Michel never regained its serenity. Shadows danced there at night, and rare visitors claimed to hear a voice whispering over and over again, "He wanted it this way." The church of Notre-Dame-des-Larmes was known for just one thing, a painting of the Virgin Mary who, according to the locals, could weep. But these were no ordinary tears. The tears that flowed from her eyes were as red as blood. For generations, villagers had interpreted this as a bad omen, proof that something dark was haunting the church. No one had been there for years, but rumor had it that the tears continued to flow, even in abandonment. That evening, a storm broke over the village. Rain pounded the windows, and the wind howled through the deserted alleyways. Inside the church, a figure advanced cautiously, flashlight in hand. Paul, a historian fascinated by religious relics, had come to investigate this legendary painting. He'd heard about the tears, but what really intrigued him was another rumor. The Madonna's eyes seemed to follow those who dared look at her. The church was icy cold, the air thick with humidity and the scent of ancient wax. The wood of the pews creaked under the weight of the silence, and Paul's every step sounded like a hammer blow. When he reached the main altar, his gaze was immediately drawn to the painting. The Madonna was depicted in dark, almost funereal tones. Her deep blue dress seemed to melt into the darkness of the background, and her face, imbued with an expression of infinite pain, was lit by an unearthly light. But it was her eyes that froze Paul in place. They were alive, or so it seemed. Two dark, almost liquid orbs seemed to stare back at him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He moved closer, observing every detail, and as he leaned in for a better look, he noticed the first drops. Fine red lines ran from the corners of the Madonna's eyes, tracing furrows down her cheeks. Paul shivered but refused to give in to fear. It had to be a simple alteration in the paint, an effect of humidity, nothing more. He reached out a hand to touch the tears, but the moment his finger touched the canvas, an icy chill invaded the room. The flickering candlelight faded and the church was plunged into total darkness. Paul stepped back hastily, his heart beating wildly. Then there was a sound, a creak, as if something were moving slowly in the shadows. He scanned the room with his flashlight, but there was nothing there. Still, the sensation of being watched was unbearable. "Why are you here?" The voice was faint, but terribly close. He turned around, but he was alone. Or so he thought. The painting had changed. Madonna's head had bowed slightly, her eyes now fixed directly on him, and he was sure she was crying more. He tried to pull away, but an invisible force seemed to hold him back. His legs felt heavy, as if invisible chains were binding him. The church walls began to vibrate slightly, and a murmur rose into the air. A low, guttural chant in a language he didn't understand. "You shouldn't look at her." Paul sensed a presence behind him. A black silhouette stood there, barely visible in the trembling beam of his lamp. She was motionless, but he could feel her piercing, burning gaze. He stepped back, but his legs were trembling. "She sees you now. She sees everything." The whisper became a scream, a shrill howl that echoed throughout the church. Paul fell to his knees, covering his ears. The light from his torch flickered, and when he looked up, he saw shadows moving on the walls. Humanoid figures, twisted and grimacing, danced around him, their movements jerky and grotesque. Madonna was now weeping profusely, her red tears falling onto the altar and forming a dark pool, and her eyes had changed. They were black, deep, like abysses ready to swallow anything they gazed upon. Paul tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. One of the figures approached him, stretching a gaunt hand towards his face. As it touched him, an unbearable pain invaded his mind. Visions flashed before his eyes, familiar faces, forgotten memories, but all twisted and distorted by unspeakable suffering. He struggled, but the shadows encircled him, pulling him towards the canvas. And as he struggled, he felt a force pulling him into the darkness of the painting. The last thing he saw was the Madonna's gaze, a mixture of pity and triumph. The next morning, the church was silent. The painting of the Madonna had not changed, apart from one new detail. In the lower right-hand corner, a figure kneeling had been added. She looked strangely like Paul, her eyes wide with fear, and the tears continued to flow. Lost in the northern mountains, the forgotten cathedral slept under layers of dust and silence. Those who knew of its existence spoke of it only in hushed tones, calling the place the Serpent Sanctuary. According to ancient accounts, it had been built over a network of catacombs that once housed a cult dedicated to a reptilian creature, a demon worshipped by a sect of rogue priests. It was said that, in the depths, the serpent always waited. The Knight Victor, an explorer with a passion for religious mysteries, arrived in the valley. A strange mist enveloped the cathedral. The massive structure seemed crushed by its own weight, its once majestic arches now bent as if the building itself were about to collapse under too heavy a secret. Yet he felt a strange attraction, an almost irresistible call to pass through the doors. The interior was plunged into icy darkness. The chandeliers and stained glass windows were broken, but frescoes, albeit degraded, still covered the walls. They depicted biblical scenes, but with a disturbing anomaly. A huge snake appeared in each painting, hidden in the shadows, its golden eyes following the viewer. Victor moved forward slowly, his flashlight casting trembling beams on the walls. His footsteps echoed strangely as if absorbed by the stones themselves. As he explored, he found a trapdoor hidden behind the altar. A rusty ladder led down into the darkness. He hesitated, but curiosity won out. The ladder seemed endless, each rung creaking under its weight. When he reached the ground, he discovered a vast network of tunnels. The walls were engraved with ancient symbols, intertwined serpentine shapes that seemed to coil around him, almost alive. In the distance, a faint but distinct sound echoed, a low, continuous hiss, like a breath rising slowly from the depths. Victor followed the sound, his heart beating faster with every step. The tunnels became narrower and narrower, and the smell of decay filled the air, stinging his nostrils. Finally, he came to a huge cavern. In the center, an altar-like stone structure stood, surrounded by carved pillars. Black candles, still lit, projected a flickering light. But what caught his eye was the massive statue of a serpent coiled around the altar. It was made of smooth black stone, but its eyes seemed to glow with a clean, golden, hypnotic gleam. He approached, unable to look away. Then a voice sounded, low and sibilant, but clear. "You've come to understand, haven't you? You want to know why they adored me?" Victor froze. The voice seemed to come from the altar itself, or perhaps from the serpent, but he couldn't see anything moving. A chill wind rose in the cavern, extinguishing the candles one by one. "Come closer. Look at me more closely." Against his will, his legs moved forward. His hands trembled as he held out a flashlight toward the statue. The golden eyes shone intensely now. And the snake, it breathed. Its massive chest heaved gently, and its body seemed to quiver as if awakening from a long sleep. Victor tried to step back, but an invisible force held him back. Shadows began to rise from the ground, forming humanoid silhouettes hooded, their hands raised in a gesture of prayer. "They offered me their souls, and now you will offer me yours." The shadows approached him, murmuring prayers in an ancient guttural tongue. Victor felt a pressure on his chest as if he were gasping for air. He fell to his knees, his eyes still fixed on the snake. The creature slowly opened its mouth, revealing gigantic fangs, and a deafening hiss filled the cavern. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. A shadow crouched in front of him, stretching a gaunt hand towards his face. As it touched him, a searing pain flashed through his mind. He saw visions, bloody sacrifices, worshippers prostrating themselves before the serpent, their bodies writhing in horrific convulsions as their souls were devoured. The creature brought its massive head closer, its golden eyes staring at Victor with unbearable intensity. "You've never believed in anything, but you'll believe in me." In a flash of golden light, everything went black. The next day, the villagers found the cathedral empty, but rumors began to circulate. At night, frightening whistles echoed through the valley, and those who got too close claimed to have seen a serpentine figure moving through the shadows. And in the center of the cavern, a new statue stood. A man, frozen in stone, his eyes wide with terror, prostrate before the eternal serpent. The stories are over, but their echoes never fade. They cling to those who dare to listen like specters hungry for memories, fragments of an ancient fear. You'd think it would all end here, but no. It's never that simple. Every story leaves a trace. A door ajar, a breath in the darkness, a whisper you might hear. Later, when all is quiet, stories don't die. They find a home, somewhere between your thoughts and your nightmares. So now, leave this place, but take a good look around you. It's not the night that's dangerous, it's what it carries. And if you feel a glance behind you, if a shadow seems longer than it should be, don't turn around yet. Good night, or something like it. We'll meet again, one way or another.